this country has had, to an extent, came from similar background, right? So with this context, it is understandable that some might argue wealth and grandeur play a huge role in determining the source of power. A sort of like a top-down narrative, whereby the source of power is deeply rooted in the society elite class. So, Shahril, do you think this is true? How far do you agree with this statement? As you can imagine, like most of the prime minister came from UMNO, right? And how does that interplay with the definition of power from your perspective?
Hi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon to Nur Aina and the other esteemed panelists, YB Senator and Dr. Zokhri. So the specific topic at hand is quite wide-ranging and necessarily vague, I suppose, in line with student conferences. Can I just give some feedback? Sometimes the topics that you guys come up with can sound awfully broad, and to less sympathetic eyes appear experienced as well, because I was back, some of the topics were a bit too theoretical and academic and a bit vacuous, if I may say. But we'll try our best to fill it with something quite specific and relatable. So power is I mean, there's a million ways you can cut it and comment on this topic and on this issue. Whether it's political power, whether it's power at home, whether it's power in terms of wider society. Maybe I want to spend my time in this opening remarks with the latter definition or the latter perspective, because I don't think you can speak of power without understanding the sort of the dynamics and the different identities that people hold at one time. And maybe that's where I would begin. I don't want to get too philosophical about it. But the concept called intersectionality, in which the concept is to understand that all of us as individuals, whether you're in politics or you're in business or you're just not in anything of high stature, everyone has multiple identities at once. Is it your ethnic identity? Is it your gender identity? Is it your class identity? Those are I suppose, the three big things that people tend to speak of in a modernist outlook. But there's a million other identities that you may find important, and people around you may find important, and the society around you puts importance on. Now, given those different identities that interact with each other on a daily basis, power emanates from the relationships between those identities and the imbalances between those identities. So it is important to understand our own privileges and power that we hold, and also understand those that go without it. And understanding it and empathizing with each other's position is the key to, I suppose, fighting and arguing for whatever justness is in your eyes. There's no point talking about power if you don't intend to fix the imbalance. If you can't fix the imbalance, at least understand and respect it and sort of appreciate where you come from. So specifically about politics and specifically about power in terms of the political sense, obviously if you are in politics, right? If you are, I don't know, if you are a male Malay person of an aristocratic or an upper middle class upwards identity, then you are in a position of privilege politically. And that has been the case, evidently, over the past decades of our existence as a country. But that is only one lens through which you look at power. There are other lenses that you can already imagine through the concept of intersectionality that I mentioned. And understanding history and understanding those identities, and given whatever is imperative at the moment, in the moment, is key to understanding whatever conflicts and whatever dynamics that exist in a political system. So, for example, to be more specific and tangible, there is obviously a backlash. There will always be an imperative of a backlash against what is perceived as the elite. So, when people who identify themselves as grassroots speak out against the elite, that is also a reaction to the power imbalance that exists. So I don't know how we begin this conversation, but I suppose the main point of my opening remarks is to basically always empathize with other people's positions, and it is easy to always look at things from your own lens and feel that you are powerless or you are in some way discriminated against, but also understand how other people might see you in your position, and realize that for almost everybody, especially in this forum, if you're on Microsoft Teams and you are a student overseas especially, you already have a certain amount of power that other people may not have. And having that understanding and appreciation is, I think, the way to go about life, rather than always only looking at things that you find unjust on yourself. So that's how I try and live my life. Obviously, with my position now, then people maybe quite rightly feel that I'm privileged, and I appreciate that. And that's something that I have to remember and feel grateful for. What we use with that power or with that privilege is what defines us as a person and as a country. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Shahril. I think it's true that the concept of power is has a lot of intersections, and sort of to strike the right balance or imbalances is opens up another debate, right? So Shahril also talks about how the concept of power can be understood from different lenses, and it just doesn't. It's a privilege, and for if the concept of power, if you come from a privileged background to an extent, but everyone does have different powers, right? So just to update on that, and to open up discussion on that a little bit further. So now we know what is power to an extent. YB Senator defines it as a evolution. Doctor says it's bringing us back to the history, and Shahril has the concept, introduced us to the concept of intersectionality. Why is it important to us to have this? So, and what need does a civilized community have to develop a deep understanding of power literacy? From my own experience, my first experience in voting was back in Nottingham, 2018, with GE 2018. But we got the letter voting a little bit late, and they expected us to post it back to Malaysia within a day before. Obviously, the time gap and differences, so I lost my first vote. But anyways, how much of an impact can it really make on national governance once youth in particular understands about power literacy in our society? Can having more people in our society being power literate change the dynamics of governance, especially in a democratically governed nation? So let me pass the floor to YB to hear out your thoughts on this.
Thank you again, Nuraina. Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting question. To me, I feel it is how you democratize power. How do you decentralize power? And again, let's not talk about power per se, but let's talk about the responsibility each individual has in terms of being able to choose, like what you said just now, Nuraina, you are able to choose who you want to vote and so on and so forth in terms of political. Okay, so being able to understand your responsibility gives you better power. All right? Being able to understand the responsibility that you may have in able to decide A or B or C or D, and the impact that you are able to give out. That is power, I feel. Yeah. Tapi, how well do you know your responsibility? Now we are talking about only 18 and so on and so forth. So what is, do they know fully their responsibility, their tanggungjawab, their peranan that they are able to do once they have casted their vote? Interesting, very interesting question. Because if you have no grasp of your peranan in making change, in making able to influence, like our friend Shahril kata, how do we empathize with others? Then you're not portraying power. You are basically doing your right sahaja, but your right to vote and the power to change by voting is probably two different things. So let's go down to back to the individual. The individual person having to understand where power comes from. Where power comes from, I believe, is having the right knowledge, then understanding how that knowledge can power your insight and decision making, and again, be able to hopefully influence the outcome. It's a process lah.
Yeah.
So let's come down to the responsibility of each individual to understand how they can make changes. Again, to themselves, to their family, to their society, to the state, to the nation, to our region, and to the world. At which level do we want to talk about power? I feel it has to come down to sendiri, your oneself. Grasp as much understanding of what power can do, but start with yourself. And you cannot talk power without knowledge, without skills, without experience. Betul?
Yeah.
And now we are talking about knowledge. We're not talking about power. So how do we empower people? We're not talking about power now. We're talking about empowering people. And how do we empower people so that power will, the real power to make positive changes to ourselves and others, and of course to the country at large. That's how I would see it, Nuraina.
Sure, thank you, YB. You're right. As much as the topic of the discussion can sound very high level, at the end of the day, it's how do we relate it to ourselves. And in this context, given how where our country is at now, it's very much important to empathize with other people and to educate ourselves in the field of power literacy, right? So you talk about empowerment. So, Doctor, perhaps I wanna bounce off with you, right? When we talk about empowerment, you previously mentioned about the concept of authority and institutions. So, empowerment, briefly, it's the act of giving an individual or party the authority or power to do something, briefly, right? And these days we hear quite a lot about youth empowerment, women empowerment, student empowerment, racial empowerment. But how exactly would you define empowerment in this context to make sure that we are better educated in terms of this field, which is power literacy? Yeah.
I would think a different way rather than describing what would be the ideal situations that says that whether you are empowered or whether you are disempowered. I would rather say an approach that what are the ways that we can actually empower ourselves and empower our communities. And we'll see when we get there whether we are able to conceptualize what is empowerment works for our country. Now, theoretically, when we talk about power literacy, as well as power to make a change, knowledge is the central things of everything. It manipulates and it influences the system. So from knowledge, we go into power, and we understand power through knowledge theoretically. But practically, as we speak in Malaysia these days, it's not so much of knowledge, but it's more onto its populisms or viraling trends that actually manipulate changes and encapsulate powers in our country. And that certainly has to be corrected. Now, I would like to also relate to what my colleague Shahril has said before, because our country is a very diverse country. We've got intersections of race, religion, age, gender, different income groups, different education status and what to speak. So we are so diverse in many ways. And each of this diversity would have its own power projections, because remember that its power is about personal interest, or is about a community, or is about group interest, and it's about leveraging this interest using influences and values and resources. So these diverse groups in our countries are trying so hard to actually putting themselves not to be at the expense of others. That's what the power projection is our country, and that's what intersection is. But at the same time, I like what YB Senator have said. Regardless of these diverse groups and diversities of power projections, we should all be reminded and converge into our responsibility. I think between Aina, Shahril, you and I, we are probably diverse in certain number of ways, but the responsibility towards our motherland remains the same. The responsibility, as well as our ownership to our love and our loyalty towards our motherland, Malaysia, remains the same. So I think having all of this diversity, we wanting to project power, if we're able to converge what would be the main ultimate reasons why we are projecting power, it's all about Malaysia. It's just because of our country, and this is the only country that we have. And Malaysia is blessed with having uniqueness in its own way. We are so differentiated and diverse in its own way, then I think there are more dialogues and avenues that can be created. So diversity could be a challenge and issue towards power convergence, as well. It also could be an added value. Now, the second thing about power literacy, Aina Hayati, is about technology. I'm not being skeptical or negative towards technology, but technology has eats our lifestyle in numbers of ways. It's kids sometimes on the process of getting knowledge because of the social media. News has been spreading so fast, and to a certain extent is taken out of context. I'm sure my colleague Shahril can even testify to that. Because of technology, people would not read newspaper where it's deliberating from A to Z. People are not looking at the news to look at the A to Z, but people would just look at the snapshots, rather the titles, and all of these WhatsApp messages to get their own opinion. So I think this is why the challenges that we have in our country, we are diverse, and everyone has to have its power projection as well as technology. And before I end, I think currently and in the future, each of these diverse groups could not stand alone. We could not work on isolation when we understand what power is. Though, for you can understand me, I'm a male, I'm a Malay, I'm a Muslim, I can't stand alone with these identities in a modern country like Malaysia. And we have seen the fact in 2008, BN has lost its two-third majority by just having 140. In the 2013, BN only secured 133. In 2018, 2018, even though PH won, PH only got 113 seats. So you've seen the two-third majority is decreasing year by year. We cannot have a dominant power in the country as well as in the world, but it's more towards a coalitions of powers, integrations of powers for us to move together as a team. And I think it's also been a consistent trend globally. We can't say right now US is the only superpower in the world. Neither we can say that China is the superpower or the second next superpower. I think these are the two, it's a bipolar kind of situations where each of these countries are trying to fight for their own survival. So I think from now and onwards, the trend is about there will be no more monopolies of powers or dominance of power. The authority is no longer based on a single identity or a single person, but rather is an integrated and an alliance of a few individuals and few organizations and parties to form what power is. So this is my projection in the future when you ask about power literacy. I hope that somehow answers the questions.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Doctor. I like when you mentioned how there are another angle for us to look at power, which is technology. And we know how in this modern society, social media influences, there's so much other, the definition of power is not deeply rooted in just institution, but everyone has, for example, social media and the smartphone, right? So just to contextualize on that technology bit, we saw a couple of months ago how hopefully everyone aware is Bendera Putih movement, the grassroots movement, when MCO kicks in, and then there are a lot of people who didn't have enough food on the table. So a group of youth actually came up with the idea to develop an app so that we can identify who actually needs support and help, sort of targeted assistance, right? And that alone has created sort of an, I wouldn't say uproar, lack of better word, but to an extent, some ministers endorsed the movement. And it opens up another debate to an extent which the movement is an act of charity. And at the authoritarian level, as ministers, you are obliged to do your policy making to make sure those things are kept, right? Not to endorse it. It's sort of like striking the right balance between that. So, Shahril, wanted to seek your opinion and hear your thoughts, since you have like a deep experience in UMNO, right? And how do you think we should measure the political literacy of a community? How do we know when it's sufficient and able to shape the community towards a better social environment, since the matter itself is very subjective, given how we saw the Bendera Putih movement?
Yeah. I don't think it's for me or for anyone really, but especially for someone in my position to tell people when their knowledge or their literacy is sufficient. That would be an act of supreme arrogance for someone in politics to tell when people are sufficiently literate or not. I think the better question is how should people in power and people in positions of privilege respond to acts of or action that claim and that intend to speak for the wider populace who don't hold that kind of privilege. So that's really my job, and that's really the job of anyone who has power, whether it's in politics or whether it's in terms of financial resources. That's what our debate should be about. And in my thinking, social media, technology, there is a certain amount of leveling that occurs because of the speed at which things can go viral, the speed at which communities can, online communities can instigate action and can build solidarity, often in opposition to people perceived to be in power. And that's just the name of the game. And that's just something that we who have positions of privilege will have to contend with as a new reality that's not about to disappear anytime soon. And in that way, without overstating the argument, because I think sometimes it can be overstated, without overstating the argument, the last 20, 30 years, because of technology, especially the last 10 years, I think, have shown that the elite and people in positions of privilege can no longer assume that they are insurmountable, or not, okay, maybe not insurmountable, that they are somehow apart, and they no longer enjoy the kind of distance from scrutiny that maybe they once did a few decades ago. In the last generation, I think politicians in the last generation maybe had an experience of how you could be quite distant, and find ways to avoid scrutiny. But again, without overstating the argument, because there are still ways to do that, I think it's far more difficult now. And in that way, social media has made it more level. It has leveled the ground a bit more. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't romanticize that. That doesn't mean power dynamics and power imbalances have suddenly gone. There are still so much evidence whereby people who have power and people who have positions of privilege can misuse it, are treated sometimes differently, and I'm sure your audience will be happy to name many instances in which that has seemed to be the case. But what's different is that it gets called out now, and we have to be aware, and politicians have to be aware, people in power have to be aware, that you are less likely to get away with anything dodgy, and you're less likely to get away with anything that seems to be dua darjat or anything of that sort. And a lot of explaining and justification needs to happen. So I think we're in a period of uncertainty in that particular respect, because it takes time. It takes time for people and for the two segments of politicians or people in power and wider public to adjust to this new reality, especially the former. The latter very easily adjust to it because it's their empowerment. But people in positions of privilege and power are a bit slower to realize what the implications are. And I want to end by something a bit more tangible again. For example, I'm in the midst of a state election that I'm going to go to right after this program. Some of the rhetoric that has been coming out this past week or so still shows that sometimes politicians and people in those positions don't understand that what we speak and what we think are important and what the wider public thinks is important might be very different. So we have mudslinging that's been happening in the last 24, 48 hours. There's been name calling. There's been skirmishes online, and the people engaged in it, including those from my party, seem to think that that's what people want. And I come from a generation that I think grew up and got into politics already realizing that social media has changed the landscape so much that I don't agree with it. And I think at this particular juncture, in this particular state election, what's important is to offer to the people of Melaka your vision, why they should think that your party is better in terms of better position to bring prosperity and all the rest of the good things. I think that is how we play the game now. And I think people can judge you based on that. Whether you are credible or not, that's another question, but they will judge you based on that. Yet, because there is still a lack of understanding and appreciation of how power in this particular sense has changed, and the elite no longer controls the narrative and controls people's thinking top down. So we still talk as if we set the narrative 24/7. We still speak as if I say this and I set this set of arguments and I engage in this mudslinging, because I feel good about it, other people who are not from, who are voters, who are not politicians, will also feel the same way I do. So there's a certain bias and a certain, I think, self-orientation that still exists among, sorry to say, but older generation of politicians. Whereas I think the younger ones are a little bit more aware that that's not how it's done. And what we should be doing is trying to put ourselves in the non-politician's point of view. And I'm pretty sure the non-politician has very little interest in who hurt who, or which party hurt which party. They're more interested in what any of these parties and any of these candidates can offer them. So anyway, I was just trying to, give something really specific about how the changes in the power dynamics in terms of communication, in terms of narrative setting, in terms of mindset, those changes have not been fully realized or appreciated or internalized by politicians. And that is a problem because if this goes on and dissonance between what people in elite positions and people who vote, that dissonance grows, the credibility of politicians and the credibility of the political class and the credibility of political parties, especially traditional old political parties like mine, will suffer. And the sooner my colleagues from my party and other parties realize this, I think the better we have in terms of hope that young people especially still want to entertain the idea of voting for parties like mine. Thank you.
Thanks. I truly appreciate when you mention and you acknowledge the elephant in the room, sort of, when most politicians currently, they can't seem to appreciate and know what is the most important thing that Rakyat cares about. And the game plan is very much...
Nur Aina, if you don't mind, can I interject skip?
Sure, YB. Sure.
I'd like to echo what my friend Shahril said just now. I think it's very true. I think what he said just now is leveling. Okay? So the power is we are going where the power is now being shared. Actually, no longer we are nobody 1 or 2 or 3% or individual is telling the narrative. Now suddenly we are like our doctor kata tadi, technology plays a major role and similar advantages when you talk about technology, where everything is now being leveled to a plane where it is almost where the grassroots or the elites are sharing the same amount of power. So I think that is what I feel what is happening in particularly if we talk about Melaka. And of course after Melaka, it is my state pula in Sarawak.
Yeah.
My state pula, which is just around the corner. And I feel the same approach needs to be taken like what Mr. Shahril kata tadi, where you are able to portray or you are able to bring out service. So again, the ability of the voters having the knowledge, having the experience, if you like, to understand that they are able to make real changes if they are able to see what positive outcome they can do for themselves, and if for the state, if you're talking about state election, or for the country. So now I feel it is a level playing field whereby the real power comes from the empowerment of individual voters. I feel. So no longer, parties or individual or whoever lah, talking about the narrative that we should be doing or we should be taking or the rakyat should be doing or taking. But now the people themselves are expressing power through things like this, like what Aina kata tadi, the white flag movement. So now suddenly they are able to show that, oh, hang on, we are able to do the same thing. Not only the politician or not only the government or the ministries or agencies, we are also able to promote positivity. And suddenly power is now being shared. So that could also be seen, white flag movement is a kebajikan movement, is a charity movement, but probably we can also see the influence in terms of political movement as well, kan? The power sharing, the democratizing of power. So that's how I wanted to share my similar thoughts dengan Shahril. Thank you, Anna. Sorry for.
Thank you, because I was alluding to that as well. Like now, the game plan has changed, and it's now the question of the willingness and the ability of the politicians to respond to that. And it seems like a long journey now, and we haven't. But progress is made, which is a really good thing for the country. Now onto you, Doctor. Now we're talking about PRN Melaka and also how democracy plays a role and how the game plan has changed for the voters, right? So democracy in general is often said to give power to the people, right? And we claim ourselves to be in a democratic state, and this can be seen by the act of exercising the right to vote for a social representative by an election to act on behalf of the people. However, in reality, whatever happens afterwards is substantially out of their control until the next election. We've seen numerous cases where changes happen in the government due to the interests of politicians rather than the people. Representatives jumping from one party to another. And you can see the debate in Parliament recently, anti-hopping bills being announced and debated after being elected under the ticket of the original party, right? And there's so much more issues that arise without many reprimands and out of people's will. So given this is how, theory versus the reality, right? So is democracy flawed? What do you think?
Well, no, it's not flawed. It has the myth. So there are the myth of democracy that we should also accept in Malaysia. And what are the myths of democracy? First, it is not really about government by the people, to the people, for the people. I don't think that is necessarily the case. I don't think that is also majority wins. Minority can also win these days, either by magic or by the law. And also that the third myth of democracy is that we are all governed by freedoms and rights. No, I think that our freedoms and rights has been constitutionalized in certain extent because Malaysia is a highly constitutional country. There are things that we can't actually freely speak out, though that generally we can say about anything, but there are certain things that remains as a taboo. So it's not really about the democracy is flawed, Aina, but I think we really have to separate what is the original idea of democracy and what democracy has changed given with the local context in Malaysia. And we have to really separate this entirely. It's different. And I think the problem that we have in Malaysia, because we keep on accusing that is not democratic, that is not the way it should be, because we tend to equalize a democracy as we understand that this should happen in Malaysia. Whereas factually, Malaysia is not really about big democratic state. We are a country that follows the constitution. I'll give you an example. Democracy says the majority wins, but in the constitution says it's a first past post. It's all according to numbers. You might have an idea who will be your prime minister during elections, but it is not actually the citizens that vote for the prime minister. It is actually the discussions among the 222 members of the parliament. So these are the things that people really are confused about. When people say, I don't vote him for the prime minister. Of course, you do not vote for a prime minister. It's the parliament that votes for a prime minister and endorsed by the Yang Di-Pertuan Agong, by his power. So these are the constitutional aspects that might be different from democracy as we understand. Therefore, what I'm probably trying to propose to all of us here today is that try to separate democracy as we understand, as well as the local context, how do we govern our country. I'm not saying that we are perfect. The constitutions need some amendments, and throughout the constitutional amendments in the past, we did that. But we are totally separate from the original idea of democracy. Second, trace back onto the country's narrative. And that is why you will see me that I'm a very consistent relating to the history, because the history and the formations of Malaysia actually shapes on what's happening today in our country. And we cannot really detach ourselves from that. And from there, only then you can certainly improvise and do any kinds of betterment in our country once you understand that Malaysia is a kind of a unique circumstance, it's a unique country with its formation, and you understand the history. Only then you can chart for the betterment of the country. So I think, again, democracy is not fault. Democracy is also an evolution. It changes, and I don't think that is also in Malaysia. I think it's also in the world. Even as a super country that claims that we are democratic, that lives with the freedom of expressions and everything, I don't think that is been practiced with the last administrations of Trump. So I guess it's like a democracy has its own challenge, and people started to question on democracy, whether it is a sustainable concept in the future. Quite provoking, but I'm just going to leave it right there.
Thank you, Doctor. It's good to hear how the history has shaped the narrative of democracy, and the system itself is not flawed. How and looking how Malaysia is governed by the constitution. And you're right, when people say I don't vote him as my prime minister, obviously you're not even allowed to vote for your prime minister. The 222 members do it, right? So
Nuraina, what Doctor said is correct. Malaysia is not a country, a standalone country. Every other country probably not to say a suffer, but it has a similar
problem.
You can see sama macam New Zealand kan, their last election, Jacinda Ardern party did not win majority. Labour didn't win majority. National won majority, but they couldn't form a government because no one wants to work with them. National couldn't form a government, even though they are majority. Tapi tak sampai 50% lah. They're majority, but other smaller component parties are unwilling to work with them. So the smaller parties ni eventually decided to go with Labour, who did not win majority, and she became the prime minister. So it's a similar but not same, or something like that. Thank you, Nurul.
Yeah, true. Thank you, YB. Just to elongate from what you said and seek your thoughts on that as well, because so now it's a question how, to what extent, to me, we educate the masses of the people's power in a democratic country, even as normal citizens. It needs to be clear what kind of power can we exercise other than our rights to vote. So I believe that it's more than that. It's not just the rights to vote, but it extends to the, as we've discussed before, the power of the literacy that comes into technology and social media and stuff. So what do you think?
Question to me?
Yep. Yes, so just to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
Thank you.